just last thing on your university thing, and then we'll go and have a look at your ancestors. But do you want to say something a little bit about because you're a historian and anthropologist, archives very important. Do you want to talk a little bit about the archival revolution and the new social history of the 60s and 70s that you were very much part of?
Right. When you're a certain kind of academic, and it probably applies in the sciences as well, there are two aspects to it. One is asking interesting and new questions that haven't been asked before. And the other is finding new sources of information, which no one has ever found. And the two are related because often the new information is generated by the new questions. And so if you're an astronomer, you know, a new telescope suddenly opens out the questions you can ask and the answers you will get. And in anthropology, as we've discussed before, it wasn't that the anthropologists were particularly brilliant people, but suddenly a wealth of new data, whole worlds that no one had explored were suddenly there. And this is what I came in at the end of. So in anthropology, I came in at the end of a wonderful period of the discovery of how tribal and hunter-gatherer and other societies work. In history, it was rather different, but the questions and the data were related. The period when I started postgraduate research, which is 1963, was a period of a big, almost revolution in history, which was related to the social revolution. Post-war Britain had changed enormously as a result of the war and so on. And you were moving, as I've said before, into the age of Elvis Presley. You were moving into a shift in gender relations, sex, class, international, the end of empire. So there were massive changes going on, swirling round you in the early 60s. And part of this was a social revolution whereby Marxism and socialism and so on was really alive. And so people were now much more interested in ordinary people, ordinary things, the kind of history which was taught by the gentry to the gentry right up to the Second World War was giving way to a new interest in social history. People like E.P. Thompson, Making an English Working Class, or Eric Hobsbawm, or Christopher Hill, were delving down into ordinary lives of ordinary people. And this was a revolution that had taken place in France with the Annales School, and it was taking place in Britain and all over. So asking new questions about how did ordinary people live and think was the flavor of the moment. And I was in part of this and taught by these people. But it's one thing to ask new questions, but if you don't have the materials to answer them, there's no point. And Geoffrey Elton used to point out, you know, that the art of being a historian is to know which questions you can ask. In other words, which are fruitful questions in the sense that there will be data. But the thing is that in the later 50s, also as a product of many changes, including local government changes and growing wealth there was a local government revolution, which meant that places, particularly where I worked, the Essex County Council, set up a superb record office. Now, there might have been something before, but now this was a whole big space dedicated to Essex records, and the same happened in the Lancashire Record Office. The same thing began to happen with the Public Record Office. Basically, money and training was put into archives and into archivists, and they started to gather in. The English are the best documented country in the world because of its a combination of its legal traditions, which I mentioned, which generated the records, and its absence of warfare, absence of white ants, absence of fire, and so on and so on. So they preserved the records, and that's another reason that our legal system is based on precedent. So you need to keep stuff. There is stuff to keep because it's generated and it's safely kept, even if it's in the attics of solicitors or in, again, something that's been preserved, large country houses, which went on to the Second World War. So every country house and every solicitor's office and other places would have boxes and sacks of old court rolls and ecclesiastical court rolls and so on and so on. And the Public Record Office had room after room, which had not been opened since they were locked 150 years ago, of Chancery records or whatever it was.
And would also, just to interject here, would the Civil War type split also help? Because you had, if history, if you like, was royalist up until the Second World War, the Puritans and the Roundheads they had their own histories and their own archives that presumably hadn't perhaps seen the light of day, and then people like Christopher Hill came along and started getting interested in them. Was that also something useful about the English history, that you had these documents of the other side, if you like, that was lying in wait for you historians to come along and find?
Well, it's a nice idea, but I can't quite see how it works, because there aren't two sets of royalist archives and Cromwellian archives. All the archives are mixed together. I mean, it is, perhaps if you stretch it, you can say that the archives of the defeated or the underdogs, the common people, were preserved alongside the upper class ones, but that's only because the upper classes needed the court rolls to enforce their court activities and so on. So basically all the archives were jumbled in. I mean, there was a kind of Cromwellian revolt in the 1960s, the young and up and coming Christopher Hills and Hobsbawms and so on, you can see of as the Roundheads against the Trevor Ropers and so on of the Tory right. There is a tension of that kind, which is even between Oxford and Cambridge. Cambridge is Roundhead and Cromwellian, and Cromwell was at Cambridge. Oxford is right-wing and royalist and so on. But the archives are the same in the two places, and the archives are similar. So basically, the stuff was preserved, and it was just flooding into the record offices. And when I arrived at the Essex Record Office in 1964 to start my thesis on witchcraft, there was an extremely good person in charge of the reading room, Hilda Grieve, who had published a book on how to read this stuff, because it's the next thing is that if you go and start working on it, many people gave up because it's written in forms of handwriting, often in abbreviated Latin. One of my main sources, which is the Ecclesiastical Court Rolls, they took shorthand notes during the case, written in shorthand Latin, often. So you just get per for pro, CR for curia, court, X for examined, exhibit, or whatever it is. And so, and written, as you do if you're just taking notes on a case. So they were almost unreadable. And for the first few months, I thought, God, I can't read a word of this stuff. And I showed it to my supervisor and asked him if he could help, Keith Thomas. And he said, no, I can't read this stuff either. People couldn't. And we went, although we had paleography classes at Oxford, they weren't this kind of document. They were court hand documents of an earlier period. So very few people could read this. So it took some months. But again, obstinacy and knowing I had to do it. And learning the framework of the courts, as I said, to interpret this stuff. So you get as I worked on for over the next 6 months or so, I got exactly the same effect as I got when I went to do fieldwork in Nepal, which is at first everything is confused and unreadable, and you can't see anything, understand anything. Then a little bit sticks out, and I came across that before, just like Bletchley Park, I suppose. Decoding. It's decoding linear B, but not quite as bad as that. So, and then gradually, what happens is this wonderful stout Cortez, looking out on the Pacific moment, when you suddenly realize you are in a world of documents which no one has looked at since they were written, and no historian has used, and it's all yours. And for several years, I was in that position with particularly ecclesiastical records, but also, in assize records and chancery indictments. And so Sarah and I, as we later worked together, were assembling and putting together lost worlds, recovering. I mean, it's like Tutankhamun's tomb, it's an effort to get in, and there they are. And so there was this moment, and it happened particularly when I came to Cambridge and ran a new seminar on social history, to which even people like Geoffrey Elton and others came, because you felt, you were exploring new worlds. And it's a moment which can't last very long, lots of people start doing their PhDs and then exploring. But just for a few years, one was at the forefront of discovering things.
Very exciting, I suppose. And do you think there's going to be is there a kind of, with the new technologies and stuff like this, will there be an opportunity for this similar sort of historian to come along and start finding new things that are hidden away in these digital archives that we're now accumulating at vast speed? Is this something, or is the digital revolution bringing a different kind of problem for historians and people?
Well, I think there may be some similarity, because almost every day, Sarah will pop up from behind the computer screen and say, "Alan, look what I found." Yesterday she popped up with something from the dispensary of the United States for 1848 on tea. What the latest scientific information on tea was in 1848. I mean, I hadn't done on my shelves, and she'll suddenly find,
Wow.
shipping logs or wonderful things. So basically, the potentials, I think, are just as great. It's
Right.
a different kind of revolution, probably much greater, because the wealth of stuff is greater. So there is a huge potential for asking entirely new questions, and that's why, another reason why I think a lot of books will be both written and read, because I'm reading books being sent to me, and they're extremely good, very good quality. And the reason is, I think that they've been helped a lot by online resources, and they've managed to put together things, because and here we'll end for coffee, but the definition of an original piece of work which will qualify you for a doctorate at Cambridge University was, in the statutes, was the discovery of new information or the connecting of hitherto unconnected pieces of information. And that summarizes what academic work is about. Only connect and discovering the new.